Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Lawrence. I'm Chief Executive of Asia House. Very good to see you all today. And welcome to today's event, New Frameworks, RCEP's Critical Role in Driving Asia's Digital Economy, which Asia House is producing in partnership with the Chong Kong Graduate School of Business, CKGSB. Thanks all for being with us today. We have an audience across the globe. Welcome to those in Asia and good afternoon to those joining us from Europe. Very good morning. We've assembled a truly impressive list of speakers from government and industry to explore RCEP, which came into force in January of this year, and how it might drive Asia's economic growth. And we are holding this important discussion at a time of enormous economic uncertainty, spiraling inflation, soaring energy prices, rising interest rates, a slowdown in growth, and fears in some places of recession. Today's event marks the launch of CKGSB's new report, RCEP, Can Multilateralism Lead to Economic Growth in Asia Pacific? And that's the issue at the very core of today's discussion. We'll send you a link to the report on the group chat function in just a moment. Please take a look at it. We'll be focusing today on digital trade and e-commerce, chapter 12 of the RCEP agreement, to look at how this new framework might streamline digital trade and drive growth. Just to let you know, today's discussion will be in English with simultaneous translation into Mandarin. To hear the translation, just press on the Chinese button on the Zoom display. And we are recording today's program. We will be making it available online, so it is very much on the record. We have a packed program. Thanks again for being with us. To get us underway, it is my pleasure to welcome back to Asia House, Chen Quoc Hein, Vietnam's Vice Minister of Industry and Trade. The Vice Minister heads the Vietnamese government's negotiating team on international economy and trade and has kindly agreed to deliver today's keynote address. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to Asia House, Vice Minister Chen Quoc Hein.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Michael Lawrence, Chief Executive of the Asia House, and Professor Xiang Bing, Chong Kong Graduate School of Business, Mr. Satinder Singh, Deputy Secretary General ASEAN Secretariat, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my great thanks to the Asia House for giving me the chance to share my view in this conference on the RCEP role in driving Asia's digital economy. As you may be aware, in 2020, when the world economy was suffering heavily the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, ASEAN and its dialogue partners has exerted utmost efforts to conclude and then sign the negotiations on the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, which entered into force on the 1st of January 2022. Apart from being the largest free trade agreement in the world so far, covering 30% of the world's population and GDP, the RCEP is also the most comprehensive FTA that ASEAN has ever signed. RCEP is also the first FTA between ASEAN and its external partners with a standalone chapter on e-commerce. Looking at the number of the new generation FTAs signed during the recent years, the RCEP shows significant efforts by ASEAN and its partners in promoting e-commerce in the region. In fact, the e-commerce commitments in RCEP are not as ambitious as those under the CPTPP. For example, RCEP does not touch the non-discriminatory treatment of digital products or source code. RCEP also exempts the e-commerce chapter from the application of the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. RCEP also, however, the e-commerce chapter under RCEP is considered as more advanced than those under the FTAs between Vietnam and European Union and the UK. And these two FTA are said to be the new generation FTA. But anyway, anyhow, they don't have such an advanced e-commerce chapter like that in the RCEP. Indeed, while these two FTA focus solely on cooperation on e-commerce, the RCEP provides detailed obligation in areas such as the paperless trading, protection of online consumers, protection of online personal information, electronic signatures, and other elements that help promote e-commerce development in the region. In addition, please note that RCEP is the first ever FTA where China made commitments on e-commerce. RCEP is also the first FTA with e-commerce commitments that ASEAN has ever signed with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea. The reason why RCEP could achieve such progress, in our view, is that its objectives align with the current practice and development goals of ASEAN countries, which aim at promoting cross-border e-commerce regionally and globally, and creating a safe and credible online business environment. We believe that the commitments on paperless trading, online consumer protection, and protection of cross-border personal information under RCEP will contribute to establish a safe and healthy environment for e-commerce and digital trade development in the region, with ASEAN at the center, helping the business community, especially the MSME, to diversify their business activities, reduce costs, and increase efficiencies. Statistics show that e-commerce, one of the components of digital economy, have developed rapidly in RCEP countries in the past few years, especially since the widespread outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, the total e-commerce revenue of the whole ASEAN in 2021 increased by 62% as compared to the year of 2020, while the revenue of each of the 5 ASEAN partners in RCEP also increased around 15% in the same period. In summary, the implementation of the e-commerce commitments under RCEP will promote trading goods, trading services in the region through the following. First, validity of electronic signatures and electronic authentication for cross-border electronic transactions. Second, enhancing the protection of the consumer rights in e-commerce and digital trade. Third, maintaining the current practice of not imposing custom duties on electronic transmission between countries. And fourth, reducing the barriers on paperless trading while ensuring national security and legitimate public policy objectives. And last but not least, establishing mechanisms to address issues related to the developmental gap among countries through consultation and dialogues. More importantly, in our view, the implementation of the RCEP e-commerce commitments will help establish a large e-commerce space based on internationally accepted standards with the participation of big economies who are advanced in e-commerce, facilitating to build a widespread digital connection in Asia region. Last but not least, in the long run, the effective implementation of RCEP will facilitate trade and economic development, which in its turn promotes the development of e-commerce and digital transformation. And from that basis, a growing e-commerce and digital transformation platform in return will create a new and better infrastructure to further promote trade and investment and strengthen regional links in Asia. And with the more and more comprehensive economic integration that ASEAN and its partners in the region are pursuing, I believe that this goal is totally achievable. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish that you all have a fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Vice Minister, thank you very much indeed. A very comprehensive overview and some interesting things that I'd like to dig further into as we get into the discussion during the program. So ladies and gentlemen, that was Vice Minister Chen Kwok Hein. Now, today's conference, as I said earlier, marks the launch of CKGSB's new report, RCEP, Can Multilateralism Lead to Economic Growth in Asia Pacific? The report draws on the opinions of 20 experts in the region who come from 9 RCEP member countries. And there was general consensus among those experts that RCEP will bring new economic opportunities to member countries by opening up sectors such as e-commerce, fintech, and smart manufacturing. Well, to brief us on the report and also to share his insights on RCEP and the unique role it can play in Asia's digital transformation, please welcome Zhang Bing, Founding Dean, Professor of China Business and Globalization at CKGSB, who joins us now from Geneva. Dean Zhang.
Thanks, Mike, and distinguished ministers, ladies, gentlemen, participants. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Asia House, our partner, for hosting multiple webinars in the past. We're really proud of this partnership. Thank you so much. And today, I would like to share with you my 4 points relating to why we do this report, why we're hosting this webinar with Asia House. And number one, with the starting point of Ms. Thatcher, the neoliberalism in 1979, and followed by President Reagan, and in 1981. And then I think this neoliberalism and new wave of globalization has generated unprecedented amount of wealth and economic development in the past 40-some years. For example, the global GDP in 1980 was 11 trillion US dollars, and in 2021 it was 96.3 trillion US dollars, according to IMF. And the global trade grew from 4.14 trillion US dollars to 44.8 trillion US dollars over the 40 years period. And also, if you look at the poverty elevation, even China alone, we have about 800 million people out of poverty. So the significance and importance of neoliberalism and this trade liberalization and the globalization cannot be overstated. It is very important for global economic development and prosperity and peaceful coexistence. We got to defend, promote globalization. And China has been the key promoter, defender of the globalization in that regard. The second point is about RCEP. The importance of RCEP was stressed by the minister who made a speech a few minutes earlier. Actually, ASEAN should be congratulated for initiating RCEP. Also play a critical role in completing this RCEP, the largest trade deal globally in terms of GDP. So the RCEP country representing 31% of global GDP, by far the largest economic bloc, and also 30% of global population, 7.4% of global trade, as large as EU. So this is probably the largest trading bloc, the largest economic bloc, So this is importance RCEP cannot be overstated either. The third point is about China. I think, China right now are representing about 18.19%. This is GDP, global GDP last year. I think more importantly, you look at the data by IMF, China has contributed about 30% of global economic increment since 2008. And one might argue without China's contribution, we could have a global depression in 2009, And then the made in China products have played an essential role in checking against the global deflation. Accordingly, improving, maintaining living standards globally, And then if you look at the, the association for countries which have traded well with China, their economy tend to perform better. China has been largest trading partner for Korea for past 18 years. Japan, 15 years. ASEAN country and Australia, 13 years already. So there's already very extensive integration for countries' economy within the region. So I think in that regard, the signing of RCEP is also right. We already have a very great foundation to move forward, And the second point of China is about the China threat. The China threat somehow gets really popular these days. But if you read the work of Dr. Kissinger, he studied the Chinese history so well, and he concluded China has no intention for conquering other territories and exploitation, no overseas colonies. So China has not been expansionist by tradition. Actually, this point was echoed by ex-Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, and he also emphasized that point as well. Actually, if you look at the history of China, when China is ruled by Han, the majority of the Chinese, and then China probably never been expansionist, Chinese territory were expanded when China was conquered and ruled by the minority from the north, and the Yuan, by the Mongols, and the Manchuria in Qing dynasty. Okay, so this is very, very important. China is a country of long civilization. By looking at its history tradition, you can tell much about the future. Whether China could be expansionist in that regard, is a good lead. Lastly, the point I want to stress is we should not, using the geopolitical risk to derail this globalization drive, which would be so much important for global common prosperity economically. That's so essential, The last point is the role of our school. I think we're very proud. We have ex-professor of ours, 3 of them, who became the chief strategy officer, some of the very top e-commerce company in China. Professor Zheng Ming became the first chief strategy officer of Alibaba, then followed up by Professor Chen Long, who became first chief strategy officer of Ant Financial. The third one, Jiang Liao, became chief strategy officer of JD.com. And we have extensive talents in this regard. Professor Sun Baohong, Sun Tianshu, Zhang Weining, Li Yang, Edward Cai, and Professor Li Haitao, you will see, you'll hear his speech shortly. So I believe we have a dream team to cover digitalization in terms of giving you both perspective of the very top company in China and the very top company in the United States. So I think our perspective very international in that regard, whether it's a 2B side, American side, our faculty know that so well, the top, and also the Chinese one. We're very pleased to share that with the ASEAN countries, always the economy in RCEP to promote the digital transformation. Thank you so much. Those are my remarks for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you at Asia House, and we too very much enjoy the partnership we have. I'd like now to welcome back to Asia House, Satvinder Singh, Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community. We've asked the Deputy Secretary General to brief us on how RCEP is reshaping the trading landscape in ASEAN and how ASEAN can benefit from the digital provisions of the RCEP Pact. So please welcome now to the conference, Satvinder Singh, who joins us from Singapore. Sorry, from Jakarta, Satvinder.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the warm welcome. Dear Deputy Minister Chen and truly very distinguished panelists and distinguished participants who've dialed in. Again, I'd like to join everyone before me in sending my deepest appreciation to both Asia House and the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business for really bringing this event together and bringing us all together in this conference. What I'd like to do today is like what Michael said, I'm sharing my thoughts on the progress of the RCEP agreement and also how RCEP might provide new opportunities for trade, employment and creation, and even digital transformation for us in ASEAN. But let me try to do this all together. But before I jump into it, what I want to do is, if you allow me, I'd like to give you a kind of a very quick update on where ASEAN is with the current economic challenges. I mean, as of May this year, I can tell you more than 70% of our 680 million population is vaccinated. And therefore, we're beginning to see almost all of our economies fully reopen for general travel. And that is extremely good news for business overall. And I think despite the global supply chain pressures and some of the inflationary challenges that Michael have raised earlier, and of course the pending geopolitical crisis that we see in Europe, the ASEAN region actually has kind of adjusted our growth projection for this year. But thankfully, our GDP growth still continues to be on the positive side for 2022. And we are going to be able to achieve a decent rate of about 4.9% this year. It would have been much more higher if there was no such issues confronting us. And many of, as you know, many of our, actually as we speak, many of the ASEAN economies today are really kind of recovered to the pre-COVID 2019 levels. And some of them are actually even returning back to real growth rates. Yeah. So more importantly, I think what we have seen is also actually trade and actually FDI returning back to the levels that we've seen prior to the COVID pandemic in 2019. And I guess one of the things that really have propelled the growth the last 2 years and is really pushing some of this growth is clearly the digital transformation changes. The changes are impacting us in the way we live, work, and play. And studies have shown, like the earlier speakers have shared, in ASEAN alone, 60 million new digital consumers have been added, making us now the third largest internet-based economy with close to more than 400 million internet users. As a result, the ASEAN digital economy already is expected to add as much as a US $1 trillion to the regional GDP over the next 10 years. Now that's significant. It clearly, you can actually see some of this already. You can feel it when you walk to the grounds in some of the ASEAN capitals. You'll see that the growth in jobs and economy is being boosted by the presence of a lot of digital activities. And this time around, it's not just the traditional international investors are walking into our borders. I think instead, in each of the ASEAN capitals, you are beginning to see the growth of homegrown, indigenous digital unicorns in many of the ASEAN member states. So therefore, definitely the positive regional prospects that we see today, we are feeling it in many of the ASEAN member states. It is also partially not just stemmed from the digital growth. I think it's also coming from this openness that we're beginning to feel with the entry into force of RCEP. 1st of Jan 2022 is where the agreement came into force. And for those of you who are not familiar, I think today, as what Minister have mentioned, it came as exactly Minister Chen has really captured the spirit very well. When the rest of the world was deglobalizing in 2020, this is where the ASEAN leaders, after 8 years of tough negotiation, in 2020 decided to put an ink and completion to the agreement. And it now actually it's ready and it's in operation. And you're beginning to see an agreement that's truly open. It's really targeted at integration, and it's able to provide us a free, fair, and inclusive and a rules-based multilateral system. And of course, hopefully, what we are waiting for is the ability for us to see the full impact of this agreement coming into force. As we speak today, all of the 15 members of the RCEP have ratified the agreement, except for 2 countries. One is Philippines, and the other one is, of course, Indonesia. And we all suspect that they will be able to ratify domestically very soon. But more importantly, I think all of the RCEP member states, they all are laying the groundwork for a full, effective, inclusive implementation of the agreement. The potential gains of the RCEP, of course, they are all well anticipated. In fact, ADB in a study estimates that by 2030, the RCEP will increase for all the parties concerned, almost an incomes close to about a growth of 0.6%, adding another $245 billion annually to regional income and creating about 2.8 million jobs in the region. In addition to that, of course, the spillover benefits is going to go beyond economic boundary of the participating countries. The study actually for the Brookings Institute projected that RCEP potentially is going to add another $209 billion annually to global economy, and that will grow further to $500 billion to the world trade by 2030. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, RCEP is a comprehensive, inclusive, forward-looking agreement, accessible to businesses both in and outside the region. Now, that's important. Allow me to elaborate. I think first, the RCEP, as you know, is going to be one of the most, it already is among all our FTAs, one of the most comprehensive, forward-looking and advanced free trade agreement that we have. Not only, like I said, it's largest in terms of market coverage, but the scope of issues it covers, as Minister has mentioned, it's really comprehensive. Actually, it's much, much broader compared to all the existing ASEAN Plus FTAs that we have. And as we have discussed, covers e-commerce, covers intellectual property, it covers competition, it covers even government procurement. None of these issues are handled significantly in any of our ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs. Furthermore, RCEP also contains what I call a kind of a built-in agenda of issues for further deliberations and the general review provision that's very active, which allows for all participating countries to be able to improve their level of commitments and discuss even new and emerging issues in the future. So that's significant. And as technology change, as activities change, I think this will give us the impetus to be able to then further innovate the RCEP agreement. Secondly, I think we need to be mindful of the parties of, basically all the parties, they are not of equal economic development. There are different levels of economic development. And the good thing about this agreement is that it contains a standalone chapter on economic and technical cooperation. We call it ECOTEC for short. This ECOTEC chapter, it aims to kind of narrow the development gaps among the parties and maximize mutual benefits for implementation and utilization. And it gives, of course, priorities, among other things, on capacity building, on technical assistance to the developing countries' parties, and for the least developed country participants of the RCEP. Again, this is going to be extremely important in our implementation, especially when we're touching on new areas like e-commerce, on areas like intellectual property, and areas like competition and government procurement. Lastly, of course, the RCEP itself, it's actually very accessible to business, notwithstanding the lengthy provisions that you see in the text of agreements. The RCEP provides provisions actually will benefit not only multinationals, but is targeted to benefit in terms of even small, medium-sized SMEs in a big way. And this include measures, we have been put into measures to streamline the trade rules, streamline transparency and consultation provisions. In fact, there are specific chapters on SME, on e-commerce, trade facilitation. All of these are going to help us in lowering cost and time for importers and exporters. So to me, I think one other thing I just want to say is that, in fact, come third quarter this year, we are actually working towards setting up a tariff calculator for businesses that will again allow them to navigate effectively the FTA in an easy online way. Finally, of course, to me, I think RCEP critically supports the integration of ASEAN into the global economy. It's truly a catalyst that is also going to help us, not just, a critical part of e-commerce is supply chain. I think this is where the RCEP plays a very strong catalyst for a much stronger and resilient supply chain, and especially important for businesses, who are operating today with deep challenges in supply chain management. In RCEP, actually, what it provides is like a single set of rules and procedures for assessing preferential tariffs across the region, essentially creating a single production base, and it also helps all of the suppliers in e-commerce value chain to be able to deal with the issues in a much more easier way. And finally, I'm just targeting today, of course, to all the businesses in UK that are dialing in. The RCEP is a very forward-looking agreement. Its rules are going to facilitate not only for the RCEP participating countries, it also facilitates non-RCEP based companies who are now investing in RCEP participating countries, allowing for example, UK businesses from benefiting from the trade rules, including all the preferential tariffs. But ladies and gentlemen, in closing, what I'd like to take this opportunity again is once again to thank everyone for allowing the ASEAN Secretary to share our thoughts. I think besides the RCEP agreement, there are a huge amount of work that's going to be channeled in ASEAN that's going to support the development of e-commerce. And we are in the process, we have finalized our e-commerce agreements. We have also adopted the ASEAN framework on digital data governance in the region. And right now, we are actually en route towards implementing large amount of implementative strategies that are going to support generally the practical sense e-commerce. So we are looking at the Bandar Seri Begawan framework, which is prioritizing a lot of activities that are going to help us in regional integration in payments, in helping to set up digital identities for businesses in the region, even looking at ways that we can start instituting paperless trade amongst the private sector. I mean, this is on top of the work that ASEAN has already done very significantly in terms of trade facilitation, where today all 10 ASEAN countries are actually connected digitally on the ASEAN single window. So again, this is all a complete package. The RCEP comes on top of that to complement the base foundation of agreements and activities that already been lined up in ASEAN. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Satvinder Singh, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community, Satvinder Singh, who was joining us from Jakarta. Let's move to our panel discussion. There's much to unpack there. Obviously, a very positive outlook from all the speakers to date, a very forward-looking trade pact as well. And one thing that Satvinder mentioned was that at this stage, the Philippines hasn't yet ratified the agreement. Well, a bit later, we'll be speaking with Alan Gepti, the Philippines Assistant Secretary for Industry Development and Trade Policy. So we'll talk to him not just about the RCEP Pact itself and what it means, but whether and when it will be ratified in the Philippines. But let's move to panel one now. And this we're going to explore in more detail some of those key issues around RCEP and digital trade. It revolves around Chapter 12, as you've heard, of the Trade Pact, which contains RCEP's rules on digital trade and e-commerce. Now, I've read and heard a wide range of views and reactions on Chapter 12. Some have been positive, some have been a little negative. Let's dig deeper into Chapter 12 and get expert views on what it means for digital trade and the streamlining of financial transactions. I'm joined now by Hanem Hamza, Regional Managing Partner at Zico Law, who joins us from Singapore. Lee Haitao, Dean's Distinguished Chair, Professor of Finance, Associate Dean for Business Scholars Program at CKGSB, who is dialing in from Beijing, and Vince Iswara, CEO and co-founder, Dana Indonesia, and treasurer also at the Indonesian Payment System Association, is on the line from Jakarta. Thank you all very much for being with us. Hanem Hamza, I'd like to start with you. We've talked a lot about the digital provisions in this Chapter 12, but from a legal perspective, how substantial are they?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Asia House and Cheong Kong Graduate School of Business for inviting me to share my thoughts, which will predominantly be based on kind of the legal aspects of RCEP and the benefits it brings to streamline financial transactions. I would, I guess, unpack it into like three different buckets. I guess the first would be a regulatory tailwind for fintech. Definitely, you know, as Deputy Secretary General mentioned, and so Deputy Minister or keynote speakers mentioned, the equal treatment for both local and foreign suppliers will provide a new wave of innovative and regional level fintech players that will emerge from the RCEP block. Because the agreement, you know, mandates the member countries to open up at least 65% of the services sector and ensure transparency of regulations. So with transparency, you have cost savings in technical and regulatory processes that will facilitate easier, I think, cross-border market entry and expansion for fintech players in the region. So there is a huge appetite. We know already last year in June, Malaysia and Thailand launched cross-border QR payment system codes. So they were the first countries. And the other thing that the countries in ASEAN are doing is their CBDCs, which is their own sovereign digital currencies. So all this will, you know, the RCEP will facilitate with the openness and transparency of kind of the regulatory tailwind. The second opportunity, I guess, that will be, as Deputy Secretary mentioned, is the micro, small, and medium enterprises, because there is a massive financing gap, you know, this underserved population, and there's a big case for the MSME lending players because they target the underserved emerging economies in ASEAN. So, you know, with the financing gap being unresolved, with the transparency, you know, and the regulatory requirements and opening up will allow for this gap to be narrowed. Third thing will be the boost for internet economy and payments themselves. I mean, we have 360 million internet users. 90% of them are connected via mobile phones. So the adoption of cashless transactions only stands right now at 40% compared to, say, the benchmark levels in the US and the UK. So under penetration, coupled with new flow of e-commerce activities, all could set a really good stage for digital payment opportunities for lifestyle banking, consumer, and other opportunities.
Thanks very much. Vince Iswara, I'd like to come to you now. I want you to look at this chapter through the lens of payment systems. You know, does RCEP enable more seamless trading goods and services, and especially in terms of SMEs?
Okay, thanks, Michael. And very grateful to be invited here. Especially want to give thanks to the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business and really appreciate being among all the distinguished speakers from all over the world, gentlemen and ladies. And really, when we take a look at this payments, right, and there is been a revolution in regards to digital payments in all over the region. In fact, if you take a look at Indonesia, the transformations from cash to cashless in the last 6 years, it actually has been led by digital payments. And we've seen more and more of this happening faster. And I think there's a lot of it being contributed because of the standardization. One of the big move from the regulators recently is the QRIS, the QR Indonesian standard, that already basically enforced every players in the market to adopt it so that it can be interoperable and interchanged. And I think that's one of the key that I think will be very important in regards to these globalizations, especially if we are adopting this RCEP role in Asia, right? If we can, agree on certain standards that we can really adopt all across the regions, that movement and that adoptions is actually going to be even quicker. And that's especially important for the SMEs. I think Hanim already mentioned that MSMEs are really, really important driving force, especially countries such as Indonesia, right? We have 67 million MSMEs in Indonesia, and that's contributed more than 90% of the labor force. If we can have this cross-border standard to be agreed by all the participants in here, I think that will drive inclusions and cross-border exchange even faster. And I believe, this should not be as difficult as before, because once the system and digital in every country is already come into play, communicating within each other and making sure the standards is applicable. I think it's just a matter of regulators come into the same room and agreed on certain standards.
Thanks very much, Professor Lee. I'll turn to you now. And Deputy Minister Hein mentioned this is the first time China has signed up to a trade deal which has a chapter on digital trade and e-commerce. So the Chinese perspective on this chapter 12 and what it means, does it mean that China could perhaps become the leader in forging international standards and regulations? What does it mean for China e-commerce companies? Can they further expand in the region, possibly at the expense of other else? What's the reading out of China on this digital chapter?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I think China is keenly interested in firstly in RCEP, as our dean said, is so important to continue to expand global cooperation in the face of a deglobalization. For digital payments, for digital economy, China has been, I guess, a leader in this area, right? So in China, it's almost like we live in a cashless society. Even before RCEP, Chinese companies like Alibaba and WeChat has expanded digital payment in Southeast Asia. For example, like tourists, like e-commerce platform, you can actually go anywhere without even using credit card, just use your Alipay and WeChat Pay. So I think like the previous speakers talking about different countries need to set up standards. China actually has, has had, Chinese companies has established some practices on the ground, based on Alipay, based on WeChat Pay, to make things make digital payment work in this regional trade. So I think looking at private sectors, how they make this payment work, how they operationalize this will help the region, the regulators will set up a system that cover the entire region in terms of digital payments. So basically, from a private practice that has already been done through like Alipay, Tencent Pay, WeChat Pay, this kind of platform, we can learn something from this in terms of building a collective system accepted by all the regulators of the RCEP countries. Yeah.
Hannah Hamza, can I put that to you? Is this an opportunity for countries to harmonize regulations in terms of digital trade, in terms of payments? Or do you expect, would you foresee, given the different approaches many countries take to the issues, especially around data, there to be a difficult path to walk?
I think it's still work in progress. It's in half, we're 6 months into our RCEP. What we've seen that definitely commitments vary and challenges include disparity within the ASEAN as well as national priorities and initiatives, right? You have different financial system and regulatory frameworks inspired by Islamic principles, common law, civil law jurisdictions. So, and ASEAN countries always have a need to find a balance between, these two priorities. Consensus is a very consensus-seeking group. So, so this is also prevails in the e-commerce space as well. So I would say the RCEP itself creates a foundation towards that goal, but there is still some work to be done.
Yeah, same question to you, Vince. Do you see RCEP as a platform to standardize regulations in terms of payments across the member countries, particularly in ASEAN, or is this likely to become a political football as data issues often do?
I think that's the thing, right? I do see that RCEP already bring a pretty good result. For example, even in Indonesia, I believe it's already increased our export by about 7.2%. So ultimately, as long as it gives benefits for every part of the members in this, I would say I think that would be an initiative for us to get into better, and especially right at the end of the day, trade, it's about purchasing on settling payments. I think that's very much an integral component to make it very successful, especially in regards to different dynamics of different countries, right? I mean, some countries it's very big on heavy industry, some countries are very big on the MSMEs. And I would see that, and as all of us see this opportunity to really improve our output, I would say this can become a platform for all of us to work together. And in regards, once again, right, in regards to the standardizations, it's every country, I truly believe, right? I mean, there's a standard on not just accepting payments, but about that data privacy, about localizations, about sovereignty, all of the things. And that can be solved currently with technology. I don't think there's going to be any issues with that. As a matter of fact, there's so many methods on how we can even check or match data without sharing any data. There's a concept called zero knowledge proof methodology, and as long as we can build this trust, that this is actually a data that is accurate and the counterparty agreed, and that's can immediately be solved. And when that happens, then there is a communications. Now what we need to do is to be able to actually, hey, now in this country we accept, let's say, digital payment is more than debit card and credit card. In other countries, the debit card is accepted widely. So how we can make sure that both actually can now talk and settle to each other, that is where we use this platform. And I truly believe it's not a complicated or very challenging. It's more on, realizing that this benefits everyone. And so let's sit together and solve it in a manner that is acceptable with everyone, regulatory framework and standardization.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, I invite those in the audience to put questions in the chat box, and I'll bring them in as and when I can. I'd like to go to the first one. I'd like to put it to you, if you don't mind, Professor Lee, and this is from Alex Roberts. And he refers to Vice Minister Hines' talk about the free flow of data, and it obviously follows on from our discussions here. What's your view on how ASEAN countries and RCEP parties will reconcile mainland China and other markets' increasing tendency towards data localization and restrictions on the transfer of data? Professor Lee, how will RCEP, or can RCEP enable those different views on data to be reconciled?
Well, that's a challenging question. Yes, yes. The recent regulation has been sort of requiring Chinese companies to localize data. But I think we can we can take a practical view, I guess, regarding the digital payment, regarding regulation in different in different areas. My feeling is maybe the best approach to resolve this issue is to let the private sector to engage in trade, to engage in let's try to move the ball forward, and let's see what are the problems, what are the critical problems we need to resolve in order, because otherwise, if you sort of stick to one thing, stick to all these different regulations, I would suspect that this may take long to resolve all the issues. So I think following Deng Xiaoping's ideas to cross the river, feeling the stone. So my feeling is at this stage of RCEP, I think it's good for everybody in this group to move things forward. So I would believe, if we get things rolling and then figure out what are the red lines in the sense that to make it work. I think that's probably the more practical way. Otherwise, we'll be stuck from the starting point. Yeah.
Han and Hamza, following on from that, is it the private sector's role now to try to drive forward this harmonization of regulation by trading and I guess identifying the potential roadblocks and trying to resolve them?
I think in both ways. I mean, when we talk about an agreement like an RCEP, a large agreement with a lot of chapters and benefits, you also then need to kind of course, bring it down to the country level and ratify and have those laws that pass. And I mentioned earlier about the different priorities of the countries, and there's also regulatory environments that's different. So it does take time to ratify and to kind of see the different interests at play. But if the governments are slow at putting the laws and regulations in place, we have seen in many cases where, the consumer and the market will just drive the changes, and then the government regulator will have to play catch up, ratify. But having the RCEP as an umbrella itself, an agreement, is very, very important. I think it's pivotal, because then there are commitments by the leaders to get this done. But then the next stage is, of course, execution. That's where
so Vince, same question to you. Is the role of the private sector now to try to drive forward regulatory change and regulatory harmonization, and to push governments to see the advantages?
Thanks, Michael. And I like the what the others are saying, Mr. Lee and Hanim, in regards to your comments in how the practical executions. I think it's good to leave it to us. And here's the thing, right? Don't worry about us. We are, no matter what, as a practitioner, we are trying to solve this as well, because we see the value, and we see there is a need in the market for this, and that there's a big need in the market for this, right? So we're heading there. And however, we also cannot forget that there is very important for us to involve the regulator, because no matter what, this is not a simple. There are so many things as a digital payment, right? Or as a financial service providers that needs to take into account customer protections, dispute resolutions, risk management, AML, and all of those things. So that's really require some regulatory helps, because we are probably understand what's going on in the country, but when you talk about cross-border, we need some help in there. But what I do see is very helpful, and if we can have some kind of frameworks to be part of this RCEP, I think we talk about the sandbox environment. I don't think we've seen yet a sandbox that is actually regional. Most of the time, sandbox is specifically country specific. I think that would be very exciting, and that will help a lot of practitioners to actually engage and try to build this, because this is not going to be a small resources that we have to put into. There's going to be significant resources that we have to commit.
So a regional sandbox, really interesting idea, but who would take the lead on that? Still with you, Vince. I mean, which government, which countries? Is this a group of, it's a consortium of private sector businesses pushing different governments to do it? Or is this an initiative out of the pity that I think Satvinder may have signed off, but is something for the ASEAN SecGen to look at? Who drives it? Vince, just wondering if in your thought, your idea, who should be leading?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I would love to. It's seriously, this is, and again, right, as the industry players, as the practitioners, we are doing it. As a matter of fact, this morning we were discussing with a global third party to solve this issue. And immediately we said, that's like, hey, which regulation or which regulator that we need to talk into? That we were all saying, it's like, okay, depends on the corridor. So we have to talk to each one of them one at a time, right? So if we can have this kind of like sandbox environment where there's immediately a task team that is included in each of the participants of our RCEP, and then we can discuss about it, I think that would be drive accelerations in this initiative.
Okay, another question from the audience, and I'll put. Sorry, yes, please go on.
So interject there. I think Singapore has always played like a leading role in terms of the sandboxes, but private sector initiatives like the ASEAN Business Club, I know, I'm sure you know Nazir and Tony Fernandez, they have come up with, private sector, I think, have also driven a lot of kind of governments to change a regulatory environment in ASEAN to be more liberalizing, kind of helping with these kind of initiatives, yeah.
Okay, another question from the audience. This is Gaiju Drury, and I'll put this to you, Professor Lee, if you don't mind. There are approximately 400 million internet users across ASEAN, but is there good enough digital infrastructure to enable those users to take advantage of it? Is this a shortcoming that needs to be addressed? And what's the role of infrastructure programs in trying to get people online to take advantage of the digital advantages of RCEP?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, right? Indeed. So when we talk about digital payment, we talk about e-commerce. It's very easy to have this, to build a payment, to have this, this app, build this, to build this application, but the underlying infrastructure is really necessary, right? So in China, I think the government has spent billions of dollars to build a physical infrastructure, to build a superhighway, information superhighway, to build a 4G, 3G, 4G, 5G network to make this to fully take advantage of this digital payment system. So I think that is definitely really important. And on top of that, you also some other previous speakers also mentioned the logistic systems, right? The delivery systems, because otherwise you make the payment, you wouldn't get your product. So I think there's a holistic approach to the integration of trade within RCEP, right? So the digital infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure. So a lot of work needs to be done from from top to bottom. So, but I think that's the exciting part, right? So that means that so much things can be done within RCEP, so that's really, if this can be carried out as we expected, this is going to be a really exciting, trade block. Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm afraid we have to move on to our next panel now. So thank you very much to Hanem Hamza, to Vince Iswara, and Professor Lee. Really very much enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much for taking part. And I want to move on to our next panel discussion now. RCEP's impact on data sharing and regional supply chains, and how this might facilitate trade and growth, particularly of startups and SMEs. And I'm pleased to be joined by Alan Gepti, the Philippines Assistant Secretary for Industry Development and Trade Policy. He's here with us today from Manila. Raymond Yee, Vice President for Customs and Regulatory Affairs at DHL Express from Singapore, and David Hardoon, Chief Data and AI Officer at Union Bank of the Philippines, Chief Data Officer at Union Digital, and he's with us today from Singapore. Thank you all very much for joining us. And Alan Gepti, I must start with you. Philippines hasn't yet ratified RCEP. You have a new government. Can we expect it to be ratified in the near term?
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for having me in this very important forum. On the matter of Philippines' ratification of RCEP, Well, as you have heard from the news, our 18th Congress was not able to completely deliberate on the concurrence process. But just the same, we are very confident and positive that in the next Congress, the 19th Congress, when they resume session, they will give priority on this. We have received a lot of supports from various business organizations, stakeholders, and industry associations, and they fully recognize the value and importance of RCEP. So with our senior policy officials. So we hope that in the immediate period of time from resumption, within the year, we can now finish the concurrence process and eventually deposit the instrument of ratification.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Raymond, I want to move to you now on some of the more detailed pieces of RCEP and what's the likely impact of RCEP's provisions on regional supply chains and customs control mechanism? What's it going to mean for trade?
Thanks very much. Just like to thank Asia House and the Cheong Kong Graduate School of Business for inviting me. I think I just like to bring it down to some nuts and bolts for business, because even if we look at digital trade, a significant amount of that is, whilst purchased online, really is the physical movement of goods across borders. And you know, like for DHL, we carry about 300 million shipments a year. Half of that are e-commerce shipments globally, and it's growing. I think from my perspective, there are a number of positives where RCEP is concerned. You know, if you look at some of the trade facilitation measures, right? First of all, you know, it promotes transparency, ability to process shipments before arrival, opportunity to comment on new regulations, right? There's a certain targeted limit of 48 hours of clearance upon arrival. And, you know, the RCEP also allows companies to even get rulings on harmonized system codes, you know, rules of origins, all the technical areas of customs. We also see that there are some areas within RCEP which are WTO plus, so it's beyond what was committed in the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is very good. And of course, for the express industry, which I'm from, RCEP also recognizes the need for fast-moving express clearances, you know, through the institution of low value thresholds for simplified clearance and so on and so forth. Having said that, you know, there are a number of things I think from a business perspective that really brings it down to the day-to-day challenges which we face in terms of moving goods across the borders. You know, I think one thing, you know, I think businesses do need to know is that a lot of the commitments in the RCEP agreement are very general. You know, it doesn't really, there's some of these are declaratory, aspirational type statements, but there really is very little in terms of details, exactly how this will be implemented. And in some cases, there are some provisions even on trade facilitation that really talks about best effort. So, you know, it says to the extent possible, where possible, as appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, from a business perspective, if you're planning your investments and your regional supply chains on the basis of a potential change in regulation, which is based on an aspirational target and on best effort by regulators and governments, I think there's a massive risk there from an investment perspective. I think there was also chat about SMEs. Unfortunately, yes, while there's a lot of talk about SMEs, the border regulations for SMEs are still very, very complicated, right? For an SME to move shipments across borders, a lot of the customs issues, et cetera, do not distinguish between what SMEs would trade versus what multinationals would trade, right? And the multinationals have the wherewithal, they have the ability to invest, they have the resources in order to plan, in order to deal with governments, et cetera, et cetera. But SMEs, unfortunately, do not have that capability. And we have yet to see provisions in RCEP that actually allow and to recognize that for SMEs. Now, the other aspect to RCEP also is, you know, from a trade and supply chain perspective, it's not just what happens at the border, but what happens beyond the borders. So for example, things like health, you know, consumer protection, and a whole bunch of other types of regulations which impact the shipment, not just at the border, but beyond the border. Now, I have to throw in here the CPTPP, which has, you know, regulatory coherence provisions within RCEP, I mean, within CPTPP, whereas RCEP just doesn't really talk about that. And these are really quite critical for businesses if you're really looking at a cross-border supply chain. And since we're talking about regional trade, I just want to talk about, you know, finally, RCEP doesn't really deal with taxation issues on e-commerce, and we know that these are big issues and they're forefront with the BEPS at the OECD and so on and so forth. But more critically, we see a lot of border authorities now imposing taxes and very complicated procedures, focusing precisely on e-commerce shipments, right? And as we know, e-commerce has been the lifeblood of a lot of economies during the COVID lockdowns. Despite that, because of the need for revenue, etc., there is now this increasing drive to impose taxation, complicate border procedures for e-commerce, which we think is really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is really a need to relook at this from a global perspective, and even from an RCEP perspective, to ensure that any regulations do not stifle the nascent industry of MSMEs, who are the majority of the vendors for e-commerce digital trade. That's all from me at this juncture.
Raymond, thanks very much. Very comprehensive. And from a business perspective, I guess to summarize what you've said, is the devil's in the detail. A lot of the detail is on there. A lot of it's aspirational, but ambiguous, and therefore it might not deliver the sorts of gains that some officials think. I'd like to come back to you and also invite those in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the chat box and bring it in. But let me talk now to David Hardoon. And David, hi, good to see you again. And you and I have had many animated conversations in the past about different government approaches to data, some very open to sharing, others quite the opposite. How do you see RCEP? Will this help facilitate a more cohesive regulatory structure around data, especially in ASEAN?
Again, just want to say thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope you're not hearing any background noise. So first, let me say that from RCEP's point of view, I think very similar to what Raymond was mentioning, is very aspirational, and there are definitely quite a number of positions from a transparency point of view. I'm actually excitingly pleased with respect to elements, for example, in terms of digital signature and how this kind of view in terms of an e-commerce perspective, which was quite a delightful, because a lot of times, especially in the field of data specifically or AI, there's an overzealous focus with respect to it, and kind of missing the trees from the forest. And in fact, if you call out specific clauses, such as the fact the endeavor to avoid any unnecessary regulatory burden, I mean, that is a very profound statement. Having said that, I do believe there's some challenges that concern me, because while the heart is definitely in the right objective, there is quite a significant number of provisions that allows for the flexibility in addressing individual parties' concerns, security requirements, to the extent of the application from the localization of data, for example, cloud computing and so forth. Now, again, while I completely understand the delicate nature and finding the balance between this, if we're thinking and trying to achieve the goal of data and data flow, and specifically across the matter of cross-border, this is actually where I would advocate that while the devil's in the detail is critically important, I would actually advocate that in this particular scenario, it is a lot more important to being conceptual, non-prescriptive, and in fact allowing a degree of flexibility from an implementary point of view. What do I mean? And just to give an example, as a good example in my point of view, and in fact one of the cornerstones with respect to how treatment of cross-border should be taken is if you look at the USMCA, where, and I understand the provision is specifically within the financial service, is whereby there in fact is to the extent we're stating that there will be no requirement of a covered person to use or locate computing facilities in any party's territory as a condition for conducting the businesses. But then, and this is the interesting point, rather than having that statement, which is very similar in RCEP, and then having essentially all the exceptions, it's essentially saying that as long as the party's financial, regulatory authorities or supervisory purposes, immediate, direct, complete, and access, essentially. So why is this mindset, I think, is critically important, and I'm hoping that perhaps as RCEP evolved, it'll be possible to have some degree of examples of such a manner, is because then the burden is on the entity and the party, essentially, which is trying to implement it, in demonstrating that the due diligence, the requirements, the privacy concerns, the regulatory hurdle is addressed, rather than upfront saying, well, we're going to allow you to essentially have cross-border data, but exclusion. The challenge there and the potential risk is that you'll have a more conservative approach taken by essentially in trade by saying, well, maybe we can't do this, or maybe we can't do that, or maybe we can't do this, rather than saying, we can, but we need to make sure we're upholding certain conditions. Now, I know it's a scenario potato, but I think when coming to data and coming down to the application and the digital trade, this is something it'll become very, very critical. Now, I believe the goal and the objective is embedded there, but what will be critical is perhaps providing at some point or another some illustration examples of how this can be implemented, given the scenario that those provisions are in place. So this is something that I think is very, very important. Now, one more thing, and just if I may, to emphasize the criticality of it, and now to specifically focus on AI. And due to the nature of AI, and this is something that's been actually evident in quite a number of cases with respect to IP laws. So, codes of AI tools are not patentable through IP laws. And while some of the measures that are actually provisioned in there in terms of patenting and protection. So in fact, it is the actual solution and its integration on the computing system that is something that can be protected from an IP point of view and from a patent perspective. And now you see the potential inconsistency if then my computing systems, I have an inability potentially in servicing from a digital trade perspective. So these are some of the things that need to be clarified and need to be addressed from the facilitation, of cross-border data.
Okay, thank you very much. Alan, gave you two quite different views there. Raymond saying the lack of detail is an issue and business is going to find this on the front line, whereas David's view very much, especially into data, the concept is agreed and there's a bit of room to maneuver. Examples need to be set to enable others to follow. Quite a different approach. From your position and the position of the Philippines, what is it? Is it a lack of detail that's a good thing? Or do you need more firm detail in this trade agreement to make it work for business?
Okay, thank you, Mike, for giving the floor. And I'd like to extend my utmost gratitude to Raymond and David for their insights. They are valid ones, and I recognize their perspective on those points that they have discussed. But let me respond to that in the context of the negotiation and also of the agreement. Number one, I'd like to start that you have to understand that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement is a treaty. It's an international agreement wherein member states, countries, economies bound themselves to do certain commitments, to comply in good faith what they have written and, of course, agreed upon in that agreement. And it being in the nature of an international agreement, we have to bear in mind that it is not that easy to revise, amend, or modify that agreement. That is why these rules, the regulations, commitments that we have agreed upon I would say, provide stability and predictability in the business environment. So that's number one. Number two, we have to take into account that the parties in the RCEP agreement have different levels of economic development. In fact, as mentioned earlier by one of the panel speakers, is that not only levels of economic development, even political, cultural, or even religious influence, historical background varies. And as far as the legal system is concerned, it is also diverse because you have influence from common law, civil law, and some are even hybrid legal systems. So that's the context. Now, the intention of having a free trade agreement is, as much as possible, you want to harmonize the rules and regulations because you want that stability. And we all know for a fact that in doing business, rules is an equalizer. So that levels the playing field so that be your multinational corporation or micro, small, medium enterprises, you work under the same rules. But of course, it's always a challenge when it comes to the negotiation. And coming from this premise or perspective, then there are two aspects also that you have to take into account. One is the public policy aspect, and the second is the commercial perspective or commercial aspect. Now, from the public policy aspect, you have to bear in mind that as much as possible, the mindset is you want also to preserve certain degree of flexibility, particularly in passing laws, rules, and regulations. And on that aspect, there are certain interests also in areas that you would like to cover and capture, such as when you talk about online consumer protection, trust in the digital environment, protection of personal information, and even issues on jurisdiction. These are the areas that you would like to cover. Now, from the commercial perspective, or commercial aspect, then they are more concerned also on protecting their intellectual property. They want to ensure also an efficient mechanism of enforcing their IP rights. They want to, of course, preserve data, data privacy, data localization, and even ensure the cross-border transfer of information, among others. So these are the different aspects wherein you have to take into account. Now, going to the issues raised by Raymond earlier, I fully agree that there are many provisions in the RCEP agreement where we can say they are aspirational. But I would say that it is not aspirational, if I will say so. I would say it's more of a policy direction. I agree that the provisions have been crafted like best effort basis to the extent possible, etc. But you have to bear in mind that since this is an international agreement, it cannot be a best effort basis forever, Mike. It cannot be to the extent possible forever, because in the course of time, the treaty will be implemented, there will be review, it will be revisited. But one thing is clear, the direction has been set, and that provides stability for our stakeholders and investors. So that's one. Number two, Raymond made mention also about the benefits for micro, small, and medium enterprises. It's quite complicated. How do you, in a way, delineate how they will navigate vis-a-vis multinational or big companies, for that matter? Again, RCEP is revolutionary as far as FTA is concerned, because this is not only the first time that ASEAN has entered into a comprehensive FTA with its trading partners, but this is an FTA wherein we have incorporated a dedicated chapter for micro, small, and medium enterprises. And if you will peruse the agreement in itself, you will find a lot of provisions and chapters that would address the concerns of our micro, small, and medium enterprises. Number one, of course, is the chapter in itself on small, medium enterprises. Number two, you have e-commerce, which is a good platform by which we can level up the competition between and among micro, small, and medium enterprises with big companies. You have also Committee on Sustainable Growth that can address emerging areas. On customs procedures and trade facilitation, for example, we have provision on transparency, inquiry points, and application of information technology, which to me is very vital as far as MSME is concerned, because this will empower them how to integrate and internationalize themselves in the global value chains. You have, of course, the chapter on competition, which is a powerful chapter because that will ensure fair and equitable treatment in the process. And also economic and technical cooperation, which was highlighted by DSG Sabender earlier. So that's would answer the concern on MSME. On the matter of taxation of course, goods on e-commerce being transacted, I think the chapter is very clear. As far as moratorium on the imposition on duties on electronic transmission, we have maintained what we have agreed before the WTO. So that's very clear. But as far as internal taxes is concerned, we have reserved that flexibility. So in other words, the parties have that flexibility to pass the necessary laws to impose internal taxes. And you have to understand that because the potential of e-commerce, of internet economy for that matter, the digital economy in general, basically have yet to be explored. I mean, we have not yet seen or we could not visualize the extent of the activities that would happen. That's why the approach of the parties here, I would say, are calculated. Now, on the matter of protection, as mentioned by David earlier, because if you're working in an online environment and you have to deal with a lot of intellectual property rights, such as source code, he highlighted the fact that this could not be patented. Of course, it would depend on the regime of each party in the RCEP agreement. But even on the assumption that this particular source code, for example, could not be patented in one regime, it doesn't mean that it is bereft of protection. Because under the IP laws, this can be protected at the very least under copyright, because this can be treated as a software or a computer program, particularly in the Philippines. Or it can also be protected under the realm of trade secret, which under the RCEP agreement is also covered. So in that sense, you can already lay down the foundation that if you're a startup, micro, small, and medium enterprises, or even a multinational company for that matter, rest assured that your IP rights within the region will be protected. And take note, there's a value add here if you are going to compare with the WTO agreement, because
enforcement in the digital environment has also been covered under the IP chapter of the RCEP agreement. So in that context, I think we have to appreciate the value and significance of the RCEP agreement, not necessarily in addressing 100% the issues and concerns of all stakeholders, because in the process, you have to balance everything. But the fact that you have the foundation and you have set the direction on how to establish a conducive business environment, I think that's a big accomplishment, especially that this has been concluded at the time that of course, we are facing a lot of challenges. That is the pandemic and the growing trend of embracing inward policies in international trade.
And again, thank you very much. A very comprehensive response to the first two speakers. You've covered all the points. But Raymond, I want to come to you now. Regardless of which view you take, is RCEP likely to trigger a reworking of supply chains, a restructuring of supply chains? Is it a platform which will drive that sort of shift?
Look, at the end of the day, strategically, I agree with Assistant Secretary Allen, right? That RCEP has a very strong geopolitical and geoeconomic goal in terms of bringing together a lot of the countries in East Asia. And for the very first time, you have the powerhouses of Japan and Korea with China within the same legislative framework, right? So I don't deny that. And for example, in DHL, we see a lot of our customers, their supply chains are completely contained within the RCEP region. Now, we have had a lot of customers ask us questions about, there's a lot of excitement about RCEP, but we have to temper that, because as the Secretary himself had admitted, there are things that are potentially forthcoming, but as far as businesses are concerned, we do not go to our boards of our global management boards to say we want 100 million in investments to build a regional supply chain on something that does not exist at this juncture, right? I think there's been too much hype on RCEP at this juncture, where companies have to invest in resources, in manufacturing facilities, etc., and restructure supply chains. We're not just looking at moving a manufacturing plant or a distribution plant. You're talking about changing an entire ecosystem that services a regional supply chain. That's going to take a while, and then no one's going to move until they see. The devil is always in the details, right? They talked about a lot of things for SMEs. They talked about stuff for the customs procedures. Fine. We will let's see it happen, right? Because that's at the end of the day what's going to impact businesses, and that's where we're going to see a return on our investment. So for me, that it's about a wait and see attitude. Although geopolitically, strategically, policy wise, yes, these are all great things. You tick the box from a government perspective, but I can't hand on heart say the same for business. Okay,
thanks very much. A final question, because we are out of time, to you, David Hardoon, and this comes from the audience. There's a really straightforward one, but very difficult, I'd imagine, to implement. RCEP countries intend to have a rule similar to GDPR.
Well, I think, okay, so just to repeat again, and by the way, I fully agree with Secretary Allen in terms of, especially once something is ratified, in the process of ratification, you can't really go back. So it's really more in terms of, and coming to this question is using it as the baseline, effectively. Using the baseline in terms of providing best practices, providing understanding. So for example, countries that do have a form of data protection, be it a full clone of, let's say, GDPR, or its own local variant, in how that could be adopted and contextualized, because actually the reality of it, not to go anthropological, data is a very cultural thing. But where it will be important, and I will slightly push, is at the end of the day, it's about the establishment and the demonstration when it comes to data specifically, and from a digital aspect of it, of trust. And I thoroughly believe that this is a phenomenal beginning. But that's the key thing that I think that ultimately needs to be the back of both governmental as well as industrial mindset, that it's a beginning, and there's a need to demonstrate it through best practices, the need of demonstrating of use cases of, well, what does it mean in the end of the day? What does it mean that I can do? And quite frankly, what does it mean I can't do? Because as we know, technology evolves exceedingly rapidly. And what may now be prohibited due to a concern of security or data privacy, in fact, is something, and I think in the earlier panel, there was also mentioning about PETs, or privacy preserving technologies, that can be, fundamentally solve some of those concerns that may be in place. So for example, the eradication of data sharing with data access, where data doesn't move effectively. So some of these elements, I think, now need to be overlaid, not changed, but overlaid on RCEP in terms of, okay, now practically what does it mean to us? And this is what I meant by specifically for data. And I do agree with Raymond that there will also be differences from an SME point of view. And now if you look at it from a data-centric perspective, the element of, okay, allowing that flexibility of how can I translate and adhere to regulatory, legal, and policy requirements of each individual jurisdiction, while not potentially fully prohibiting. And so in other words, encouraging the innovation, encouraging the digital engagement, encouraging the data flow.
Tremendous. Look, I'm afraid we are out of time. In fact, we've run way over time. So we need to wrap it up. What a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could take it much further, and we would like to revisit this. Obviously, RCEP's a huge issue for us at Asia House. So hopefully we'll get back together and continue this discussion at a later point. Just remains for me to thank our panelists, Alan Gepti, David Hardoon, and Raymond Yee. Thank you very much indeed, all of you. Thanks to all of our speakers today. It's been a discussion rich in content and ideas, and we're most grateful to all of you for taking part. Thank you very much to the participants who have dialed in. I hope you've enjoyed the program. And my thanks to our partners in this, CKGSB. So we'll wrap it up for now. Thank you all for being with us. To take very good care, and hopefully we'll see you all very soon. Goodbye for now.